Hi, and welcome to the 27th installment of the Dad Project. First off, so sorry for taking so long to get this installment out, but life intervened. Anyway, tonight, as promised, we'll take a look at the Grumman F9F Panther and Cougar. The F9F Panther would be Grumman's entry into the jet age. Grumman had built thousands of propeller-driven aircraft during World War II, the F4F Wildcat, F6F Hellcat, and the TBF Avenger at their Bethpage plant on Long Island, and through license with other manufacturers. But those contracts would either be canceled outright, or in the case of the Avenger, continue to be built in smaller numbers to serve with the Navy in several guises following the war. The F7F Tigercat and the F8F Bearcat would be the epitome of twin-engine and single-engine Navy fighter design, but came too late in the war to be built in any numbers, and their fates would be sealed with the arrival of jet aircraft. We'll look at both the Panther and the Cougar. It's hard to disassociate the two, and after that deep dive, we'll take a look at my dad's time in the Cougar. The Cougar would be his introduction to high-performance jet aircraft, and the aircraft he and many others would train in before strapping into the F-4 Phantom for their time in Vietnam. But first, you know the drill. Let's listen to Orson Welles recite John Gillespie's High Flight.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Like many advancements in aircraft propulsion systems, and naval flight systems, the Army Air Corps and the Naval Air Forces were the beneficiaries of invention and advancements of other countries. Both the Army and Navy were fiscally conservative with their limited interwar budgets, choosing to fund aircraft projects that were designed around proven engines and airframe. Very little was spent on the design and development of unproven ideas. Manufacturers could expect no funding for design and development outside the well-trod path of proven designs. The British and Germans, on the other hand, were more amenable to funding such programs, not blindly, but with more of an open mind. The development of the jet engine was just such a program that would be seriously developed by both the Germans and the British. Air Commodore Sir Frank Whittle would be the leading light for the British. Whittle wanted to fly. The RAF did the best not to let him. His first effort to enter the RAF found him passing the entrance exam with very high marks, but standing at only 5 feet tall, he failed the physical examination. Undeterred, he put himself through a rigorous physical program to better develop what God had given him, and in the meantime grew an additional 3 inches, only to find out the RAF did not give second chances. Again, undiscouraged, he applied once more under an assumed name and was accepted into the 3-year training program for aircraft mechanics in 1923. Although not a flying billet, he kept his head down and excelled at model making and was recognized for his mathematical genius. That was enough for him to be recommended for officer training at RAF College Cranwell in 1926. He quickly became an exceptional pilot that tended to fly on the edge of acceptability, but so did many other candidates. What set him apart was his math genius and a thesis. A requirement for each candidate to graduate was a thesis. Whittle's, titled Future Developments in Aircraft Design, among other things, noted the potential for aircraft to fly at high altitudes at speeds over 500 miles per hour. Part of his thesis was that these two parameters could not be achieved by propeller-driven engines, but by the motor jet, basically a compressed air system that was generated by a piston engine. As he would be quoted much later in John Golly's Whittle, The True Story, I came to the general conclusion that if very high speeds were to be combined with long range, it would be necessary to fly at very great height, where the low air density would greatly reduce resistance in proportion to speed. Although others had considered Whittle's thesis before him, it would be Whittle who would, with the help of several others, develop one of the first viable turbojets to propel an aircraft in flight. On the German side of the fence was Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain. Perhaps Ohain wanted to be a pilot, but by all accounts, Ohain was a physicist whose impetus was to develop the jet engine, not to fly himself, and early on began to work for the Heinkel Aircraft Company, who saw the potential of his ideas. As he would later be quoted, he found the elegance of flying spoiled by the enormous vibrations and noise from the piston-engine propeller combination. And although Whittle's efforts would eventually be funded by the British government, Ohain was supported by Heinkel, who funded his work very early on. And although Ohain began his research later than Whittle, they were soon on a parallel course. On August 27, 1939, with test pilot Erich Warshitz at the controls, the Heinkel 178 flew for the first time and became the first jet-powered aircraft to attain controlled flight. Several things are notable about the flight. One, this flight took place several days before the German invasion of Poland. Secondly, the Heinkel 178 was a tail dragger. And finally, the development and first flight of this aircraft was a corporate secret. Not even the Luftwaffe was aware of its existence. When it was finally demonstrated for a group of Nazi officials, they were underwhelmed. Unknown to Heinkel was that an even more secretive Reich Air Ministry jet engine program had already been underway, and that in September of 1939 the development of a single-seat jet fighter was ordered, despite a general order that had been issued that only established programs be funded. Long story short, BMW and Junkers would continue German jet engine development with government funding, while Heinkel and Ohain's work would continue without government support. Their efforts would lead to the development of a two-engine design, the Heinkel 280, that, like the 180, ran afoul of the Knights of bureaucracy and would be canceled in favor of the Junkers-powered Me-262. So what were Whittle and the British doing? After an inspired and promising start, Whittle began to run into the realities of the short-sighted. Having been issued a patent for his jet engine design, he was unable to convince the Air Ministry to pay the £5 renewal fee for his patent. Unable to afford it himself, he let it lapse in 1935. However, through the good offices of friends and investors, Whittle was able to continue the development of his jet engine design. From 1935 until 1939, the fortunes of the consortium, known as Powerjets, that funded his effort went from bad to not so bad to bad again. It wouldn't be until the Air Ministry made yet another visit to Powerjets that the Director of Scientific Research, David Randall Pye, came away convinced that Whittle's design was of major importance. In an example of bureaucratic gymnastics, the Air Ministry bought Whittle's engine and then loaned it back to him for further development, while contracting with Gloucester Aircraft Company for a simple aircraft design to test the engine in flight. This marriage of resources would result in the successful flight of the Gloucester E-28/39 in May of 1941. With the combination of a successful test flight and the war in Europe heating up at a rapid pace, Gloucester, that had already been informed by Lord Beaverbrook, Minister of Aircraft Production, to stop work on their night fighter, would turn their full attention to the development of the twin-engine Gloucester Meteor. But what about the U.S.? What were we doing? Anything? Vladimir Pavleka is best known for his invention of flush riveting while working at Douglas Aircraft. This would be one of many aeronautical systems that Pavleka would develop while at Douglas. Additionally, Pavleka had been working on a gas turbine engine since 1933, and in 1935 he presented a proposal to Douglas Aircraft for his gas turbine engine. Douglas Aircraft then forwarded his proposal to Pratt & Whitney, who then forwarded it to MIT. The consensus? Even if the engine worked, which it won't, there is nothing useful for it to do. Pavleka's response? He knew the history of gas turbine development. The experts at MIT and Pratt & Whitney didn't, and this meant they would miss out on the beginning of a new industry. I knew I was right. This was all true, but what seriously hampered the U.S. development of the jet engine was that the various pieces needed to move forward in an orderly way were siloed. Layer upon layer of secrecy and the aforementioned concern with the mass production of proven designs and limited development funds limited aggressive development of the jet engine, unlike the B-29 and the atomic bomb. Oddly, it would be General Hap Arnold's visit to Britain soon after the Gloucester's first flight, where Arnold and his assistant, Major Donald Cairn, attended a demonstration flight at Gloucester that would move the U.S. into the jet age. Seeing the Gloucester on the tarmac, Arnold asked, "Where are the propellers?" "There are none. It's a jet," was the reply. "What's a jet?" asked Arnold. Despite being the chief of the U.S. Army Air Corps, he had no idea about the ongoing development and existence of jet aircraft. Fortunately, because of his position and the close relationship of the U.S. and Great Britain, Arnold was able to immediately procure 2 of the Whittle's engines. They were flown to General Electric in the U.S., where the GE would build them under license. Despite ourselves and ignoring Pavlica's best efforts, the U.S. entered the jet age. Regardless of Axis and Allied programs developing a viable jet aircraft during the war, only 3 jets would see service by war's end. The Arado 234, a twin-engine high-altitude reconnaissance bomber, the Me-262, and the Gloucester Meteor. It has long been posited that had the Me-262 come into the war when it could have as a fighter and not as a fighter bomber, the Allied bombing campaigns would have been more difficult, with the war potentially lasting longer. But it didn't, and it, like the Meteor and Arado, suffered from the same early developmental problems of the jet engine. Very short legs because of high fuel consumption, slow to respond to throttle inputs, and engines that required overhaul with minimal use. In the case of the Me-262, it was a good day when the engine would last longer than 10 hours, and aggressive throttle inputs usually resulted in flameouts with little chance for restart. However, the Gloucester Meteor would go on to serve in the RAF for years following the war. The German designers and their aircraft would be swept up after the war with Operation Paperclip and its Soviet counterpart to form the nucleus of Allied and Soviet jet design. This is not to say that the U.S. was sitting on its hands while advances were made elsewhere. No, 2 American jet aircraft were being made and test flown during the war, the Bell P-59 Air Comet and the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. Both were powered by British engines or licensed copies of British engines. The Air Comet first flew in 1942, but despite continued improvements and better engines spread out over 60 copies, it was barely mediocre and it was canceled. Lockheed Shooting Star first flew in 1943, being delivered in a war effort 143 days, and would become the Air Force's first operational jet aircraft following the war. It would serve through the Korean War, and like tonight's subject, the F9F Panther, would find its straight-wing design seriously outclassed by the MiG-15 swept-wing design. Jet development following the war was a collection of meticulous and well-intended designs that filled the gamut from not bad to marginal to anemic to downright dangerous. For the Navy, nothing outlines this better than a picture of 4 designs flying at the Naval Air Test Center in 1950. Flying in a loose formation from the top, you have the Vought Pirate. It has the distinction of being the first Navy fighter with an afterburner and built using composite materials. 30 would be built and thoroughly tested before being canceled in 1950, having been renamed the Groundhog by those who flew it and assessed as submarginal, a polite term for something far more derisive, I'm sure. We'll skip over the Panther for the moment and focus in on the Cutlass. The Navy's first swept-wing fighter was a design heavily influenced by German jet design and study. Now, whether it was poor execution of that influence or any number of its deficiencies, the Cutlass was downright dangerous. It killed 4 test pilots, and over a quarter of the airframes were lost to accidents. Amazingly, 2 Cutlasses spent a year in the Blue Angel livery, and again, long story short, this odd, somewhat ugly, underpowered aircraft managed an ignominious short life as a Navy interceptor. Which brings us to the Panther and the Banshee. The Banshee was the outgrowth of McDonnell's first jet aircraft, the F-H Phantom, which was the first Navy jet to land on a carrier. The Phantom, like the Pirate, left much to be desired, and very few were built, but would lead to the much more capable Banshee. Along with the Panther, the Banshee would be the backbone of the Navy's jet fighter force during the Korean War. Both suffered at the hands of the MiG-15. And why the straight wings in the first place? Navy fighter design is dictated by the aircraft carrier. Aircraft handling around the carrier, particularly in the landing configuration, is critical. The F-4U Corsair was initially relegated to Marine land-based squadrons because of several landing deficiencies, most notably its long cowl that would obstruct the pilot's ability to see the deck, a tendency to bounce on soft oleos, and a high stall speed. All these problems were eventually overcome, and it was one of the few prop-driven fighter aircraft that continued to be manufactured after the war, and it served effectively in the Korean War next to the jet aircraft that were its intended replacement. To make life more difficult for the Navy's first jets, the carriers they would be serving on were straight-deck war-era ships optimized for prop-driven aircraft. The flush-deck hydraulic catapult had been introduced in 1934, and most carriers were equipped with them. However, aircraft of the era were able to get airborne without a catapult, including the Tokyo Raid B-25s flying off the Hornet. In fact, many of my father's S2F carrier launches from the last straight-deck carrier in the Navy, the Lake Champlain, were done without the use of a catapult. This would not be true for the jets, so slow flight characteristics were of paramount concern, thus the straight wings. Of the numerous Essex-class World War II-era carriers that were recommissioned for the Korean War, it wouldn't be until 1952 that the first true angled-deck carrier, the modified USS Antietam, would be operational, and its sister ship, the USS Hancock, wouldn't have the first operational U.S. Navy steam catapult until 1954. This didn't stop the Navy from pushing for a swept-wing fighter before both of these advances in carrier design could be implemented and the design of carrier-borne fighters be unfettered. The existence of the MiG-15 was known before the Korean War broke out. The surprise came when red-haired Chinese pilots became involved in the conflict. The straight-winged P-80, Banshee, and Panther stood little chance when flying against a well-trained and experienced MiG pilot. But the U.S. Air Forces held air superiority throughout the conflict, so its effectiveness was limited. What it did do was accelerate the development of swept-wing American fighter aircraft. I mentioned the F-7U Cutlass earlier, and that was a 5-year development period that resulted in an aircraft of suspect ability and very limited active-duty lifespan. The F9F Cougar, however, was a program that delivered a swept-wing version of the Panther in 6 months. Grumman had assured the Navy that it was only a matter of mating swept wings onto the Panther. So sure was the Navy of Grumman's guarantee that the Cougar was only perceived as an incremental improvement on the Panther. Thus, its F9F designator was passed on to the new aircraft. While Grumman was developing the Cougar, North American was diligently developing its navalized version of the F-86, the FJ-2, that would morph into the FJ-3 and its final version, the FJ-4. As mentioned in my installment about the A-4, initial performance problems with the A-4 gave brief rise to considering an attack version of the FJ-3 that never came to fruition. Both the FJ series and the F9F Cougar would have limited lives as frontline fighters, but what Grumman did that so many other aircraft manufacturers would do to extend the lives of their production lines was to offer up the F9F in a photo recon version and as a trainer. It would be the trainer version of the Cougar, the TF-9, that my dad would fly in 2 periods of his flight career. After flight school, my dad was assigned to VS-32, flying S-2Fs off the Essex-class Wasp. Following a fire on the Wasp in August of 1959, he and his squadron went back in time as they were attached to the last straight-deck carrier in the Navy, the Essex-class Lake Champlain. This was to change dramatically as the only dividing line in the test pilot school was between rotary wing pilots and fixed-wing pilots. All fixed-wing pilots were expected to fly props, turboprops, and jets with equal proficiency. So, on January 18, 1962, my dad strapped into a Lockheed T-2V-1, the navalized version of the Air Force's venerable T-33. After a little over 50 hours, the Navy was satisfied that he was ready to fly any old jet, and he would be turned loose on the F-11F, FJ-4, and the F-4D to finish the jet portion of his test flying syllabus at test pilot school. Upon graduating, he would be assigned to service test, where he would fly the Cougar for the first time on May 2, 1963. On November 13, 1964, he would touch down following his 7th and last flight in the Cougar while at service test. All 7 of those flights were listed as 1K, or daylight test flights. They were so innocuous that he doesn't list any test program of the TF-9 in his resume, and all those flights included actual or simulated instrument time. My suspicion is that these were instrument proficiency flights and not testing anything in particular other than my dad's ability to fly in instruments. You would think that would be the last he would see of the TF-9, but like many of the planes my dad flew in test pilot school and service test, he would find himself reintroduced to the TF-9 for an intense 2-week period in September of 1966, as he and his squadron mates prepared for an even more intense period of training in the F-4B as they readied themselves for their involvement in Operation Rolling Thunder. The VF-121 Pacemaker Squadron began life as VF-781 in 1946 flying the F9F Panther. VF-781 was flying over Korea off the Oriskany in November of 1952 when Lieutenant Royce Williams found himself in the midst of the most famous unreported dogfight of that conflict. For 35 minutes he fought 7 MiG-15s by himself. At the end of the fight he had shot down 4 of the MiGs and likely a 5th. He returned to Oriskany out of ammo, no hydraulics, and 263 holes in his straight-wing Panther. Deemed unsalvageable, it was pushed overboard. He had just tangled with Soviet naval aviation pilots, and it was quickly decided at the highest levels to scrub the incident from the official record for fear of drawing the Soviets into the conflict. He would later be credited with 1 kill and a probable with no indication that they were Soviet-piloted aircraft. But upon the release of Soviet records following the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was confirmed that he had indeed shot down 4 of the MiGs, with only 1 of the 7 returning to base. All very exciting, but by the time my dad arrived at Miramar, attached to VF-121 of the replacement air group, the Panthers were long gone. But its swept-wing brother, the Cougar, was there in the form of the TF-9. So, for 2 weeks in September of 1966, my dad and his squadron mates crammed in a little over 20 hours of simulated nighttime instrument training in the Cougars. The Navy, satisfied that he was able to do this, then turned him loose on the F-121's F-4As and Bs, and for the next several months and over 100 hours of flight time in the F-4, he prepared to take the Phantom to war. But that's another story. His time in the TF-9 and his thoughts on flying the Cougar, like just about every other plane he flew, is a mystery, at least to me. But, at least with the Cougar, I can be sure that it was a very serious, eyes-wide-open time in what was considered an advanced trainer, as he and his squadron mates in VF-151 prepared for an even more serious introduction to the F-4B. In any case, have a look at installments 10 through 13 if you'd like to know more about his time in Vietnam and the F-4B. And join me next time when we'll have a look at yet another Grumman product, the F9F Tiger, which my dad has an unusual relationship with. So, until next time, thanks for joining me for the 27th installment of the Dad Project. And for the 27th time, as many of you already know, I continue to tell the stories I had hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate y'all being along for the journey. So, please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching, and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.